Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going deep into Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And this book tackles a really interesting idea that the Protestant Reformation, specifically some of its more, austere branches, might have been a surprising catalyst for modern capitalism.
You know what's so interesting about Weber is that he wasn't saying that Protestantism caused capitalism. He was much more interested in how ideas, even religious ones, can have these ripple effects throughout history and shape things that we might not expect.
Right, it's this hidden connection between the spiritual and the material. To set the stage for our listeners, can you give us the short version of what Weber was getting at?
Absolutely. Essentially, Weber argues that the spirit of capitalism, think rationality, efficiency, that drive to accumulate wealth, found a really receptive audience in the ethical framework of certain Protestant groups, especially what he calls ascetic Protestantism, groups like the Calvinists and Puritans.
Okay, let's unpack this. So if we're diving into the book itself, where do we even begin?
Well, a good place to start is with Weber's analysis of Benjamin Franklin. He uses Franklin's writings as a prime example of this spirit of capitalism in action. Think about Franklin's emphasis on hard work, frugality, that famous saying, time is money. Weber saw these values as deeply intertwined with the ethics of ascetic Protestantism.
That's so interesting because on the surface, it seems kind of counterintuitive. How could a religion that's focused on the afterlife end up promoting a system so obsessed with worldly success?
That's the paradox, right, that Weber is wrestling with. To understand this, we need to dig into his concept of the Protestant ethic. One of the key doctrines he focuses on is predestination, the idea that God has already decided who is saved and who's not, and there's nothing you can do to change it.
So you can imagine the anxiety that would create. How do you live with that kind of uncertainty?
Exactly. And since good works can't earn you salvation, these believers were looking for signs, for clues that they were among the elect. Worldly success, hard work, wealth accumulation. It became a way to demonstrate God's favor. It's like proving your worthiness through material achievement.
So it's not about enjoying the wealth, it's about what that wealth represents.
Precisely. And this ties into another crucial concept, the calling. Weber points out that for Protestants, the idea of a calling expands beyond just religious vocations. So suddenly any honest work, whether you're a blacksmith or a banker, takes on this almost sacred dimension.
It's like your work becomes a testament to your faith.
You got it. It's not just a way to make a living, it's a way to glorify God. Weber actually has this famous line where he describes this new work ethic as the iron cage of rationality. It's efficient, it's productive, but it can also feel inescapable.
So we're starting to see how these seemingly unrelated things, religious beliefs and economic behavior, are starting to weave together in a really fascinating way.
And that's just the beginning. Weber goes on to distinguish between worldly asceticism and the traditional kind of asceticism, like monks withdrawing from the world. Worldly asceticism is about channeling that religious zeal into disciplined, methodical work within the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects. So instead of renouncing material wealth, you're proving your piety by pursuing it diligently. But then, and this is key, you don't indulge in it.
Exactly. You're denying yourself those worldly pleasures. Wealth becomes a symbol of God's blessing. But it's not for personal enjoyment. You reinvest it, you grow it, you keep working.
Which, if you think about it, creates the perfect conditions for capitalism to thrive. It's like this engine of constant accumulation fueled by religious anxiety.
And here's the truly fascinating part. Weber suggests that this work ethic, this spirit of capitalism, might have outlived its original religious motivations. He points to figures like Franklin, who embodied this capitalist spirit even though he wasn't traditionally devout. It's like the idea took on a life of its own.
So it started as this religiously motivated behavior, but then it became ingrained in the culture, in the very fabric of Western society, even as religious fervor waned.
That's the core of Weber's argument. It wasn't that Protestantism single-handedly created capitalism. It was more about the unexpected ways that these religious ideas shaped economic systems, having these unintended consequences that continue to ripple through history.
Wow. I'm already seeing the world differently. This is definitely a deep dive.
And we've only just scratched the surface. Next, we'll explore some of the historical examples Weber uses to illustrate these ideas in action, how this played out in the real world.
Can't wait. I'm hooked.
Welcome back. So we've laid out Weber's core argument, how the Protestant ethic, particularly that worldly asceticism, might have paved the way for modern capitalism. Now let's get into some specific examples.
Yeah, because it's one thing to talk about these ideas in the abstract, But I'm really curious to see how Weber connects them to actual historical events.
Well, one of the things Weber does is look at the rise of certain industries in areas with strong Protestant populations. He suggests that this wasn't just a coincidence. The Protestant work ethic, with its emphasis on diligence and efficiency, might have given these communities an economic edge.
So it's like their religious beliefs were actually translating into tangible economic outcomes. Are there any specific industries he points to?
He talks about the textile industry, for example. In some Protestant areas, there was a real boom in textile production. Weber suggests this could be linked to that Protestant emphasis on hard work and frugality. You know, those values we were talking about earlier?
It's like those values became woven into the very fabric of their economic activity, literally. It makes you wonder, could something as intangible as a religious belief really have that kind of impact?
That's the question, isn't it, that Weber is grappling with. And he doesn't stop there. He also looks at things like bookkeeping practices. Remember, for those early Protestants, accumulating wealth was a sign of God's favor. But indulging in that wealth was frowned upon, so they needed a way to track their earnings, to make sure they were being good stewards of what they saw as God's blessings.
So this intense religious scrutiny led to the development of more sophisticated accounting methods.
Exactly. And those methods, of course, became essential for modern businesses. It's like a seemingly mundane practice. Bookkeeping has these deep roots in a particular religious worldview.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it. All those spreadsheets and financial reports we take for granted today might actually owe a debt to the spiritual anxieties of 16th century Protestants.
Right. It really highlights how interconnected things are, how these seemingly disparate realms, religion and economics, can influence each other in profound ways. And Weber gives tons of examples like this throughout the book.
So we're starting to see how Weber builds his case, how he connects those dots between the Protestant ethic and the rise of capitalism. But I imagine his ideas have also sparked some debate. Not everyone agrees with his conclusions, right?
Of course. Weber's work is incredibly thought-provoking, but it's also been a lightning rod for criticism. And engaging with those critiques helps us to get an even deeper understanding of his ideas.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. What are some of the main criticisms that have been leveled against Weber's thesis?
Well, one of the most common criticisms is that he oversimplifies the relationship between Protestantism and capitalism. Critics argue that he cherry-picks historical examples and downplays other factors that were just as important, if not more so, in the development of capitalism.
So it's like he's maybe focusing too narrowly on one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Exactly. Some historians point to the sophisticated financial systems that were already in place in Catholic Italy centuries before the Reformation. They argue that these financial innovations played a crucial role in laying the groundwork for modern capitalism, regardless of what was happening in the Protestant world.
That's a really interesting point. It challenges the idea that Protestantism was this singular driving force behind capitalism's rise.
Right. And then there are those who argue that Weber underestimates the role of pre-existing economic conditions in shaping the Protestant ethic itself. They suggest that the rise of a market-oriented economy, with its emphasis on individual initiative and competition, was already well underway before the Reformation. So maybe those economic shifts actually influenced how certain Protestant doctrines were interpreted and practiced, not the other way around. It's like the chicken and egg dilemma, which came first.
You got it. It's a complex question and there's no easy answer. Another critique is that Weber focuses too narrowly on ascetic Protestantism, those stricter sects like Calvinism. He sort of overlooks other forms of Protestantism, like Anglicanism in England, which didn't have the same emphasis on self-denial and austerity.
And of course, England was a major player in the rise of modern capitalism. So that complicates things a bit, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It suggests that maybe that intense worldly asceticism that Weber emphasizes wasn't absolutely essential for capitalism to flourish.
Okay, so there are some valid critiques of Weber's thesis. But even if we acknowledge those critiques, does that mean his whole argument falls apart?
Not necessarily. I think even Weber's biggest critics would admit that he raises some incredibly important questions about the relationship between ideas, values, and economic systems. And those questions remain relevant, even if we disagree with some of his specific conclusions. So it's less about proving or disproving every detail of his argument, and more about appreciating the bigger picture he paints, the way he challenges us to think about the complex ways that culture and economics are intertwined.
Exactly. Because even if we set aside the specific historical claims about Protestantism and capitalism, Weber's broader point about the power of ideas to shape history remains incredibly important.
It's like he's giving us a new lens through which to view the world, a lens that helps us see beyond simple economic determinism. and appreciate the subtle ways that our values and beliefs influence the way we organize our economic lives.
You said it perfectly. And that's why Weber's work continues to be so influential, even controversial after all these years. It forces us to confront the fact that economic systems aren't just driven by material forces, but also by these less tangible, often overlooked cultural and social factors.
So it's not just about supply and demand. It's also about the ideas and values that shape how we understand those concepts, how we participate in the economic system.
Precisely. And those ideas can have a ripple effect, sometimes in unexpected ways, shaping the course of history.
This has been so illuminating. I feel like I'm starting to understand the world in a whole new way.
Mm.
But before we get too carried away with our philosophical musings, we need to wrap things up for today.
Agreed. But we're not done exploring Weber's ideas just yet. Next time, we'll delve into some of the broader implications of his work, looking at how his insights have been applied to understanding everything, from the rise of science to the development of modern bureaucracies.
Can't wait. See you all next time for the final part of our deep dive into the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So far, we've unpacked Weber's core argument and grappled with some of the critiques. Now, I'm really curious to explore how his ideas extend beyond the historical context of the Reformation. I mean, is this just a story about 16th century Europe? Or does it have something to say about the world we live in today?
That's a great question. And it's what makes Weber so relevant. You know what's fascinating is how his work has resonated far beyond that specific historical period. His insights about the power of ideas, this process of rationalization, the unintended consequences of things we do, those ideas have been applied to all sorts of things, from the rise of science to how modern bureaucracies work.
Okay, so let's break that down. How does this idea of rationalization connect to something like science?
Well, Weber saw rationalization as a key characteristic of Western civilization, and he believed it played a huge role in the development of modern science. He argued that this methodical, disciplined approach to understanding the natural world, think about the scientific method, shared some similarities with the Protestant ethic.
So instead of attributing everything to divine mystery or the supernatural, there's this drive to understand the world through reason, through observation, through experimentation.
Exactly. It's all about finding those underlying laws that govern nature. Weber saw this as a hallmark of both the scientific mindset and the Protestant worldview. That emphasis on systematic observation, the search for universal laws, testing your hypotheses. These are the pillars of modern science.
And that same drive for rationality,
Yeah.
for systemization, also extends to how we organize ourselves, right?
Gotcha.
Enter the bureaucracy.
You got it. Weber was fascinated by bureaucracies, those large, complex organizations that have become so central to modern life. He saw them as incredibly efficient, but also potentially dehumanizing.
Okay, so help me understand this tension. On the one hand, you've got this efficiency, this ability to coordinate all these complex tasks, manage tons of information. But on the other hand, it can feel like we're trapped in this impersonal system.
Exactly. Weber was really perceptive about that. Think about that classic image of the faceless bureaucrat, just blindly following rules without considering individual circumstances. Weber recognized that this kind of impersonal, rule-based system, while efficient, could lead to a sense of alienation, this feeling of being just a cog in a machine.
It's like we gain efficiency and predictability, but maybe at the expense of our humanity, that sense of individual agency.
Right. And this tension, this trade-off, is at the heart of a lot of contemporary debates.
Yeah.
Discussions about globalization, about secularization, about the future of capitalism itself.
Wow, okay, so we're going big picture now. How do you see Weber's work informing those conversations?
Well, think about it this way. Weber provides a framework for understanding how globalization might be speeding up this process of rationalization on a global scale. With the spread of capitalism, technology, and these bureaucratic systems all over the world, there's this increasing emphasis on efficiency, on standardization, on calculability.
And on the one hand, that leads to some amazing advancements. We're more interconnected, information travels faster than ever, new technologies are constantly emerging. But there are downsides too, right?
Absolutely. There are concerns about cultural homogenization, the erosion of local traditions, the growing power of these massive corporations. These are all consequences of this relentless drive toward efficiency and rationalization that Weber was writing about.
It's like a double-edged sword with both incredible potential and some real dangers. And what about secularization? How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Weber argued that as societies become more rationalized, traditional religious beliefs and practices tend to decline. It's like the rational worldview just leaves less room for mystery, for faith, for that sense of the sacred that was so central to pre-modern life.
Because if you can explain the world through science and reason, you don't need to rely on supernatural explanations.
Exactly. And while Weber didn't necessarily view secularization as a bad thing, he did wonder what might fill the void left behind by the decline of traditional religion. What would give people a sense of meaning and purpose in a world where those old beliefs no longer hold the same sway?
That's such a relevant question even today. What do we find meaning in? Individual achievement, material possessions, political ideologies? Or are we just adrift in a sea of meaninglessness, trapped in that iron cage of rationality that Weber talked about?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it leads us to another one. What about the future of capitalism, if Weber's right? And that initial spirit of capitalism was fueled by this religiously motivated work ethic. What happens when that religious fervor fades?
Does the whole system grind to a halt? Or does capitalism find new sources of motivation, new ways to legitimize itself?
Exactly. Does it become all about endless accumulation, just for the sake of accumulation? Or can we find a way to reinfuse it with a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than ourselves? Maybe it's about finding meaning in innovation, in sustainability, in creating a more just and equitable economic system.
It's like Weber's work is less about providing answers and more about forcing us to ask those tough questions, to grapple with the complexities of the system we're all a part of.
You put it perfectly. The Protestant ethic isn't some historical relic. It's a framework for understanding the world we live in today, the world we're creating for tomorrow.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, I think the big takeaway is that the world is far more interconnected than we often realize. Ideas have power. And even something as seemingly distant as the Protestant Reformation can still resonate in the 21st century.
And it's not just about history. It's about understanding ourselves, our motivations, the values that shape our economic lives, and the unintended consequences of our actions.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little bit unsettling. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those intellectual gears turning.